Hey everyone, welcome back to another video, and today I want to tell you a little story. A young girl in a little red cloak is walking through the woods to visit her grandmother when she encounters a wolf. The wolf asks her where she's going, and she replies, "My grandmother's house," and gives him a little bit of information about where she's going and why, before hurrying along on her way. When she arrives, she opens the door, she sees her grandmother, but something feels a little bit off. She exclaims, "Grandmother, what big eyes you have! What big ears! What big teeth!" She slowly begins to realise that her grandmother isn't her grandmother at all, but the wolf she met earlier in disguise. He snuck to the house, ate her grandmother, and in a single bite he eats up the little girl herself. Just when you think everything's hopeless and everyone's dead and it's an awful thing, a big strong woodcutter swoops into the house, brandishing his axe. He slices open the wolf's belly and frees the little girl and her grandmother. The women are safe, the wolf is dead, and the big strong man has once again saved the day. A familiar story and a very familiar fairy tale that I'm sure a lot of you guys maybe heard as a child. I know I definitely did. Little Red Riding Hood was one of my favourite fairy tales of all time. Even now as an adult, I adore fairy tales, and you might know this if you've seen some of my older videos, especially the ones like this one where I go into the deep dark origins of fairy tales and find out where they came from, what they mean and what we can learn from them, and also try and think about what relevance they have to us today in our world, in our life, how we can still learn things from them. With that in mind, today I want to share a few of the possible origins of the story of Little Red Riding Hood and a cheeky little bit of analysis about what it all means. We did cover some of this stuff briefly in, I think it was my first Gabby Hanna video, in which I compared one of Gabby's poems to the Caroline Duffy poem Little Red Cap, which is one of my all-time favourite poems. And within that, talking about that poem and analysing that, I spoke a little bit about Little Red Riding Hood and its origins and meanings, but today we're taking that idea and going into way more detail. And I'm just going to say this now, it is fascinating. As always, as I tell you these stories and share the information that I found with you and share my thoughts and opinions and ideas, I also want to hear from you, so let me know down in the comments what you think at every stage of this video. Leave me a comment telling me what bits you find interesting, surprising, if I've missed anything that you know that I haven't mentioned. Just please share your own thoughts and ideas too. If you have an idea for analysing this story and the meaning and what you take from it that I haven't mentioned or that I haven't thought about, please share that with me as well. I love hearing your thoughts and reading your comments, and I do read every single one. And as a final note before we jump into the meat of this, as always, I cannot mention every single little thing in this video, even though I wish I could. It's going to be long enough as it is, so I've left all my sources and a load of stuff for further reading down in the description below, so please go check out those links, those academic papers, those book recommendations, everything. It's fascinating stuff. So in doing this research, a great article I found from National Geographic writes that folktales are like biological species. They literally evolve by descent with modification. They get told and retold with slight alterations, and then they get passed on to the next generation and gets altered again. And this is exactly why tracing back the origins of a fairy tale like Little Red Riding Hood is so tricky at times, but also so interesting. It's full of twists and turns, and you always uncover something new. You never quite get the answer, you know? Lots of possibilities, and that's kind of what makes looking into something like this so much fun. Most of the research done into the Little Red Riding Hood tale that I found has been done by an anthropologist called Dr. Jamie Tarani, I hope I'm saying that right, who works and studies at Durham University, and I've actually linked his paper, which is titled The Phylogeny, I can never say that word, the phylogeny of Little Red Riding Hood. I've linked that paper below because it's a really interesting read, and it goes into his methodology for how he tried to trace these origins of the fairy tale. He basically used the same method that we use for reconstructing evolutionary relationships amongst living things to map the relationship between different stories and folk tales and myths and so on, based on what we know about the language used and certain plot elements, and it's a fascinating read. I really do recommend it. You'll also notice as I talk about each of these stories, you know, that were the origins or influenced the Little Red Riding Hood tale that we know today, you'll also notice in each of them that while many details change, for example the species of animals that are the good and bad guys in the stories, you know, and some of the characters' motivations might change, like in some it might be out of hunger or whatever. There are often so many similar plot points, and they're kind of what I want you to focus on. So all these stories involve innocent characters, usually children, often young girls. All of these stories have some kind of predator to be feared, whether that's a mythical creature like an ogre or something a little bit more real and actually threatening like a wolf or a tiger or a jackal. You'll also notice various themes, for example, disguise and trickery, innocence versus experience, good versus evil, and following established rules versus stepping off the kind of well-known beaten path. So one of the earliest origins of the story that we know of has been traced all the way back to Aesop in the 6th century BC. But even this one is thought to not be the original. It's thought that Aesop based these tales on other things he'd heard, and it all went back earlier. You have to remember that storytelling used to be oral, and it was passed on between people, between families, between travellers, and all kinds of things. And storytelling was a great way to teach lessons and share messages, and for, I guess, information to be passed on in a very memorable and entertaining way. So stories like this that do have a meaning and a message and something that we can learn from go back thousands of years, not just to the 6th century BC, but before. So the problem I had was that even though I found a load of sources saying that, you know, Aesop and his fables are likely to be one of the earliest known origins of the Little Red Riding Hood story, I couldn't find any sources that actually listed specific fables as the origin. None of them specified which ones they thought were the original. So I did a bit of research, I had a lot of fun with this, and basically I read most of Aesop's fables, and even some of the ones which are wrongly accredited to him. And basically Aesop had a lot of stories about wolves, a lot of stories about deception and lies and trickery, and basically I just read as many as I could and picked out a few to talk about here that I thought might be origins or influences of the Little Red Riding Hood story, but again I can't really talk about all of them, it's just not enough time in the video. So the first one I came across that really stood out to me was called The Cat and the Mice, and it's a simple story of a cat who pretends to be a sack hanging from like a rafter in a barn so they can try and trick some mice, or in some versions of the story it's actually chickens, who knows, so they can try and trick these smaller animals of mice or chickens, whatever, into being eaten by the cat. The cat's tricking them. That's basically the premise of the story. But his disguise is seen through either by an older mouse or a rooster, and they're like, nah mate, we're not falling for this. Shoo. Then I found another story called The Ass in the Lion's Skin, which again definitely has a kind of disguise element, but it's sort of backwards compared to what we know of Little Red Riding Hood today. So an ass puts on a lion's skin to either go around scaring people or to be able to feed in peace, depending on which version of the story you read. But a fox recognises the sound of the ass's voice, or in some cases he recognises his ears under the lion's skin, and basically his disguise is seen through, and the fox is like, nah mate, you're not fooling anyone. On your way. You've seen a pattern here. There's also a lot of wolf-themed fables. It's harder to say than I thought. For example, The Wolf and the Crane, The Wolf and the Lamb, The Wolf and the Shepherds, and the very well-known The Boy Who Cried Wolf, in which a boy raises a false alarm twice, only for the wolf to actually show up the third time, and this time the boy's cries aren't believed, the villagers ignore him, and the wolf eats the boy and the village, and everyone dies. Yay! There's also the fable of the wolf in sheep's clothing, which I found is often falsely attributed to Aesop, but wasn't actually written by him, or at least no sources suggest it was. One of the earliest mentions of it actually is in the Gospel of Matthew, so from the Bible, which wasn't actually written until much later, between 70 and 110 AD, and it's thought this may have been influenced by other Greek tales and fables, but not necessarily Aesop's. And basically, the premise of this is that a wolf disguises himself as a sheep in order to get closer to the other sheep so he can eat them. Simple. Basically, it's a big warning about how outside appearances aren't everything, people can be deceptive, even people who look nice can be predators underneath, and to be very careful about who you trust. So a very similar message to what we have in the Little Red Riding Hood tale today. Moving forward in time a little bit, the next story which may have played a role in forming the Little Red Riding Hood tale that we know today was told by a Greek traveller and geographer called Pausanias. Again, these names are so difficult to pronounce, words are difficult to pronounce. I struggle pronouncing everything, like even basic words, so please forgive me if I've got any of these wrong. I tried to look some of them up, but it's still a struggle for me. I'm just bleh. Anyway, this guy, he apparently went round retelling this local legend. So again, the story's older than this, but this is the first known kind of record we have of it. So he went around between around 110 and 180 AD, telling this local legend about how each year in some place in Greece, a virgin girl was offered to a malevolent spirit dressed in the skin of a wolf, who would then rape the girl. Then one year there was this boxer called Euthymos who came along, he killed the spirit and married the girl who had been offered as a sacrifice that year, who was still a virgin. This is definitely one of the first ones I found in my research that has the elements of an innocent young girl being ruined or sacrificed to a monster. This is the first one that had those elements of virginity and loss of innocence and that kind of thing. It's also the first one I found that had that kind of strong man swooping in and saving the day. Yeah, like I mentioned, the fact that this malevolent spirit in the skin of the wolf raped the virgin girl is also very significant in terms of relating it to the Little Red Riding Hood story that we know today, because many people think it's actually a tale about sexual maturity and puberty and loss of innocence, you know? The girl enters the forest as a young, innocent girl and leaves after being tempted by the wolf and straying from the path and getting into bed with the wolf. She leaves a woman, no longer innocent and pure, but mature and sexually experienced and an adult. Like I said, this Greek legend or tale or whatever is the first one that kind of has those elements in it, and I found that quite interesting. Despite what you might think so far though, not all of these stories come from Europe. A lot came from African folk tales. Now, a lot of these African folk tales are very, very old, again, going back hundreds upon hundreds of years. There was a collection published by this guy called Leo Frobenius. Names again, I struggle, I'm sorry. He published a collection in 1921, but obviously the stories are much, much older. So while they were recorded in the 20s, they're from roughly the same time as these are the ones I'm mentioning here. I found the English versions of these translated in a book called African Genesis, Folktales and Myths, and I immediately saw so many familiar stories. So in the collection of folktales which originated from the Kabila region of Africa, we have the story of the jackal and the lambs, in which case the jackal here is the bad guy, not a wolf, because, you know, locally jackals are more of a threat than wolves, so it makes sense. Anyway, in this story, a jackal tries to imitate a mother's sheep's password to gain access to her children and eat them. At first, the lambs know that he doesn't have the same voice as their mother, so they refuse to let him into their home. So, in a gruesome twist, the jackal runs off and he finds an anthill, and he lays on it, and the ants come and eat his throat, and they change the way his voice sounds, so it's soft like a sheep's. And then he goes back to the lamb's house, and with his new voice, he replicates their mother's password. The lambs fall for it, let him in, and he immediately eats them all. The mother comes back from her trip, and she's like, "Oh God, that damn jackal's eating all my kids." Ugh. So a few months pass, and she hatches a plan with a local shepherd, and she basically gets the shepherd to beat the jackal to death with his crook because the jackal ate her children. So again, you have innocent young children, you have a predator in disguise, you have a, you know, damsel in distress apparently, and a big strong man who comes in to save the day and kills the bad guy. No happy endings here really. Yeah, there you go. We're starting to see some pretty strong themes emerging here though, and it's thought that these African tales were kind of more influenced by the European ones, but also these ones influenced the later European ones. It's kind of like they're all influencing each other, you know? This is why Jamie Tarani's research is so interesting and important, because we find that it's not just a linear progression. These stories were told and changed and moved around, and different places influenced different ones, and sometimes stories would branch off and then they'd rejoin and kind of influence each other again, and it's all like a big complicated web. It's not just a linear timeline. There were also similar stories, again, coming from Africa, some from North Africa, some from South. There were big differences there. There were versions which included tales of a young girl visiting her grandfather, who was recognised by the sounds of her bracelets. In another, there's a young girl who's attacked by an ogre after he imitates the voice of her brother, and all kinds of different things. But again, the prevailing themes were very, very similar, even if the details of who the predator was and who the victim was and these elements of disguise and recognition and stuff, even though those details were different, the themes were the same. Moving forward in time to 1023 AD, and this is where it starts to get really, really fascinating. A schoolteacher in Belgium, who was called Egbert of Liège, wrote a collection of stories, proverbs, Bible extracts, and all sorts of little things to be used as a main curriculum in his school, and with the hopes that it would be used in other schools as well. He called this Fecunda Ratis, again, pronunciation, I'm sorry, or in English, this translates to the richly laden ship. The collection included a ton of different stories, but one in particular called De puella et lupellis seruata. Yeah, don't make me say that again, please. Or in English, which is a little easier to say, about a girl saved from wolf cubs. And this took those old Greek and African and also Asian fables and stories and folklore, we'll talk about the Asian ones in a second, it took all of them and kind of combined them and made a new story and added a very strong Christian perspective. And so this is where it gets interesting. Basically, this is a short poem in which he tells of a man who lifts a young girl from her baptism font and gives her a red woolen cloak. At 5 years old, she goes out into the world, and I quote, "At sunrise, footloose and heedless of her peril, wearing her little red cloak, and she's attacked by a wolf," who in this case is meant to be like a literal symbol of the devil. So this wolf is the devil in disguise, and is taken back to its lair so it can be fed to the little wolf's children, the wolf cubs. However, the wolf cubs and this big bad wolf devil are unable to harm her because of her red cloak, a symbol of her baptism, a symbol of protection by God. And so the moral of the story is basically meant to be the devil can't harm you when you're under God's protection, which is a rather unique take on the whole story. It kind of moves away from the innocence versus experience in terms of sexuality and talks about it more of being under God's protection versus not. It talks about being a Christian versus not. It talks about baptism saves you versus not. Does that make sense? Hope it does. From what I can tell as well, and I might be wrong, but this is just what my research kind of showed me, but from what I can tell, this is one of the earliest editions of the red hood or red cap or red cloak or just red fabric in general to the story. And that's interesting because in general, people have assumed that the red cloak is meant to be a sign of either menstruation or puberty or lust and seduction, something like that. So it's interesting that it was added in this Christian version as a symbol of God's protection, as a symbol of baptism. It's very interesting to me how that's kind of developed. Moving forward in time a little bit more to 14th century France and Italy, and we get another very distinct version of the story. And this is probably one of the most gruesome ones yet. La Fina Nonna, which translates to the false grandmother, which tells the tale of a young girl who visits her grandmother, and when she gets there, the grandmother, who is actually the wolf in disguise, feeds her a meal which he has actually prepared from her grandmother's corpse. So the wolf doesn't eat the grandmother, but kills her and prepares her as a meal to feed to this young girl. Yeah. The girl is literally tricked into mistaking her granny's teeth for rice, her flesh for steak, and her blood for wine. And you'll see a lot of references to this particular version of the story in Caroline Duffy's Little Red Cap. There's also a lot of sexual references in this tale, as the wolf kind of asks her to take off her clothes and throw them in the fire before getting into bed with the wolf. And in many versions, this is where he eats her once she's naked and in bed with him. A lot of stuff going on there, isn't there? I guess you could kind of see the young girl literally eating her grandmother as her kind of like replacing her as the matriarch of the family, as some kind of rite of passage, as some kind of metaphor maybe for purity and sexual experience. I'm not sure. There's a lot going on there. You'll have to tell me what you think that means, what your interpretation of that bit of the story is, because that's an interesting one, and probably one of the most gruesome versions that there is. Moving forward a little bit to 16th century Taiwan, and here I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different Asian versions of this story, because these are particularly interesting, and I love this particular version. It's a Taiwanese story, but it's similar to ones that have also been told in Japan, Korea, and China. This one, it definitely seems, was influenced by the earlier European and African stories, and it's called Grand Ant Tiger. And this time you'll notice the predator isn't a wolf or an ogre or a jackal, but a tiger, because obviously in a lot of Asian countries, a tiger was a way more realistic threat than any of the other things would be. So it makes sense that there would be these cultural and local kind of changes to who the bad guy is, you know, to be more relatable, more scary, more realistic, I guess you could say. So in the story of Grand Ant Tiger, like many of the earlier tales, this doesn't feature a little girl going to her grandmother's house, but instead the predator coming to the young girl. You'll notice this was the case in the Aesop's fables, in the African one, and so on. So after the mother leaves her two young girls alone in the house, a tiger comes to the door and pretends to be the girl's aunt and asks to be let in. But the oldest girl says that the voice is too gruff to be her aunt, so the tiger attempts to disguise it. She comes back again. Again, very reminiscent of the African tale we heard about earlier with the jackal getting the ants to eat his throat to change his voice. At this point, the tiger with the softer voice puts her paw kind of through the door and says, "Look, I'm your aunt." But the oldest girl says, no, your hands are too rough to be my aunt, because, you know, the tiger paws. So the tiger goes off and tries to disguise her paws to make her hands seem smoother and softer, like a person's. Again, reminiscent of the Little Red Riding Hood tale we know today, but kind of backwards, you know? The girl is quick to spot and call out these errors, so the predator has to disguise themselves in response. Whereas in the modern tale, the predator's already waiting in disguise, and the young girl starts to point out these flaws, but still falls for it. So it's kind of backwards to what we know, and I feel like in this Taiwanese version, the young girl is a lot smarter than the Little Red Riding Hood we kind of know today. Very interesting distinction. So eventually, Grand Ant Tiger does manage to fool the girl, unfortunately, and gains entry to the house, where she quickly eats the youngest child, or at least her hand, depending on which version you read. The first girl, the older child, is like, damn, gotta do something about this, and tries to come up with a plan, and she's like, "Oh, Auntie, you must be hungry. Let me go out to the garden and pick you some fruit from the tree, 'cause, yeah, plan." And there's several elements of the girl trying to trick the tiger, and the tiger trying to trick her, and kind of things like tying a rope to her legs so she won't run away, and all kinds of stuff. Basically, how it ends is the girl climbs a tree in the garden, and somehow, the details of this and how she gets it are kind of vague, but it happens, the young girl manages to pour boiling hot oil down the throat of the tiger from this tree that she's climbed, which kills the tiger. This was one of the first instances I found where the young girl actually manages to best the predator herself. She managed to save herself. She manages to kill the predator herself and get away, rather than having a man come in and, you know, save the day, or rather than having her mother come and save the day, or rather than just dying. That said, it's still very, very consistent with the themes of innocence versus experience, because, you know, at the start of this story, this young girl is kind of, you know, naive and protected by her mother, but at the end of the story, she's gone through this whole ordeal and she's survived. She's now this big, brave, strong tiger killer. She's kind of matured and saved herself, and it's kind of wonderful, you know. I think it would be fairly accurate to say that this story has the kind of theme or message or moral that with bloodshed comes maturity. And while in the story the bloodshed is someone else's, you could argue that this is a metaphor for puberty and menstruation, you know? Moving forward in time, once again to the 17th century, and we get the version of Little Red Riding Hood, which is probably the one most people assume to be the original, but as we've seen today, and so far in this video, was actually inspired by hundreds and hundreds of years of folklore and poetry and myths and legends and so on. So it's not the original, but it's definitely part of the story. So, 17th century, Charles Perrault. He wasn't exactly the original author, like some people think, but rather he collected folk tales and myths and other stories which had previously been passed on orally, and he published them all together for the first time in 1697 in a collection which he called, and oh god, it's French. I can't speak French at all. Can read it, can't speak it. Histoire et contes du temps passé avec des moralités. Contes de ma mère, Loy. There we go. Tell me how bad that pronunciation was. God, I've always suffered from this. I'm from Yorkshire. I struggle to say English words, never mind French or any other language. But you may know this better when it's pronounced better, but you also may know this better as the English title, which is Tales and Stories of the Past with Morals, Tales of Mother Goose. Sound familiar now? So the version of Little Red Riding Hood which appeared in this collection was called Le Petit Chaperon Rouge, and it features a young girl who is described by Perrault as being an attractive, well-bred young lady who wore a red cape. She is tricked by a wolf on her way to her grandmother's house, and she unwittingly gives the wolf information which he needs to avoid the local woodcutters, to find her grandmother's house, to get there before the little girl, and to eat her grandmother, because as the English translation of the story says, the poor child did not know that it was dangerous to stay and talk to a wolf. So the wolf finds the grandmother's house, tricks his way inside, and immediately eats her. He then jumps into bed, disguises himself in the grandmother's clothes, and waits for the girl in the little red cape to arrive. On her arrival, he makes her get into bed with him, and we get the classic lines of, "What big arms you have, what big eyes, what big ears," and so on, which of course culminates in Little Red exclaiming, "Grandmother dear, what big teeth you have!" And the wolf replies, "C'est pour te manger," or as we know it, all the better to eat you with. Perrault may have collected this story from other folk tales and so on, but he did add something completely new into the mix. He ended each story that he told with a moral, and he basically explained what he thought the story was about and what he wanted the readers to take away from it in the form of a poem. I found one translation of this which opened with the lines, "Little girl, this seems to say, never stop upon your way," which is interesting, but then I went and found the original French version, and it's far more specific. Again, excuse my pronunciation here. On voit ici que de jeunes enfants, surtout de jeunes filles, belles, bien faites et gentilles, font très mal d'écouter toutes sortes de gens. So basically, he's not just offering the warning to little girls, but specifically to beautiful and kind young girls from good families. Can't pronounce it, but I can read it and basically understand it. He then goes on to warn, in the form of poetry in French, that if you stop and talk to strangers, it's no surprise if you are providing a wolf with his dinner. He then goes on to specify how not all wolves are the same, some wear disguises. Il en est d'une humeur à court, sans brut, sans fiel et sans courroux, qui privé, complaisant et doux, souvent le genre demoiselles, jusque dans les maisons, jusque dans les rues. Please, all mock my French pronunciation. I know it's bad. Basically, what he's saying is, of wolves, some are friendly and likable, you know, some they're not noisy or angry or too in your face. They're actually fairly unassuming, helpful, they can be pretty sweet, you know, they just look like regular guys on the street. And they'll follow young girls that they meet in the streets, and sometimes they'll even follow them into their homes because, you know, they're that charming and they seem that nice, they seem ordinary. Obviously, I think by following them into their homes, it's a kind of metaphor for marriage, you know, and becoming part of their lives. And he ends with a warning that, you know, you should know that these seemingly gentle wolves are often the most dangerous of all. But I actually prefer how the English translation words this, which is, "'Tis simple truth. Sweetest tongue has sharpest tooth," which I think is pretty cool. So if you consider this story as a metaphor for loss of innocence and sexual maturity, this does make a lot of sense, this moral that Perrault put at the end of this story, you know. It's a very important warning to young women that sometimes men who can seem all lovely and sweet and nice in public can not always be good men in private, you know. They can seem lovely and charming and sweet and gain your trust, and then follow you down the street, follow you into your home and your bed. And at that point, once you're married to them and stuck with them, they can be dangerous. So in this sense, I think it is quite an important little story, not only for the time, but for modern day women to listen to as well, you know? It comes back to the don't trust a wolf in sheep's clothing. Don't judge someone by their outward appearance. Really get to know someone before you commit to them and get invested emotionally or sexually or in any way, intimately. Again, moving forward a little bit to the 19th century, and we get the Brothers Grimm, and they included two stories which share very similar roots that we've covered today in their collection of, Grimm's fairy tales. One was Tale 5, The Wolf and the Seven Kids, and the other was Tale 26, Little Red Cap. I will link some links. Link some links. I will leave some links below about The Wolf and the Seven Kids, but for time's sake, I'm just going to cover Little Red Cap today. This version is almost identical to the story that Perrault published, but with one main difference. As well as leaving out the moral at the end, they changed the ending of the story. In Perrault's version, the little girl is eaten. In the Grimm version, it's a little more graphic and brutal, as the wolf is described as, hastily eating the grandmother, and I quote, without mustard or bread, as if she were a hunk of cheese. And then, like I say, the ending is different. So the wolf eats the young girl and falls asleep. At which point a huntsman bursts into the house, slices the wolf's belly open, and saves the young girl and her grandmother. So we have this male hero element again, and I can't help but see this as being a bit of a product of patriarchy, Women being saved by the big strong man because they're too dumb and weak and helpless to save themselves, The typical damsel in distress saved by a man from the big bad wolf. I think this is probably why the Grimm version is one of my least favourite ones of all. I love the versions like the one from Asia with Grandaunt Tiger, where the young girl is strong enough and wise enough and resourceful enough to save herself. I love those ones. In some of these versions, in the Asian ones, in the European ones, even in the African ones, there are instances of the girl saving herself either by punishing the wolf, tricking the wolf, managing to get away, by enlisting the help of other local women to help drown the wolf, something like that. And I think they're probably the most empowering and interesting ones to me, but that's just my opinion. And with that, we're kind of up to what we know as the traditional Little Red Riding Hood fairy tale today. However, since then, there have been numerous retellings and reimaginings and adaptations of the Little Red Riding Hood story, and they're still being made and published and worked with today, and I think it's wonderful. I obviously don't have time to talk about all of them, so I want you to let me know down in the comments, what is your favourite retelling or reimagined version of Little Red Riding Hood, whether it's modern or older. Let me know what your favourite is. To mention a few of my favourites, for me, I of course have to mention Little Red Cap by Carol Ann Duffy, one of my favourite poems of all time, in which a girl enters a consensual relationship with an older man, a wolf, and while in this relationship she grows and matures and learns from him, but as she gets older, as she matures, as she grows, as she experiences things, she ends up slicing him open, seeing her grandmother's bones inside, filling his belly with stones, and leaving him, emerging from the forest and the relationship as a strong, mature, independent woman. And it's wonderful. I also love the character of Scarlet in Marissa Mayer's The Lunar Chronicles, who is a farm girl, a pilot, an amazing marksman, and who ends up falling in love with a lunar man/wolf hybrid. Pretty interesting. Love those books. There's a Little Red Riding Hood in Roald Dahl's wonderful collection Revolting Rhymes, who literally pulls a pistol from her knickers and shoots the wolf dead and ends up wandering off wearing a wolfskin coat, which is a wonderful, wonderful, empowering little twist and very funny. There's Ruby in Once Upon a Time, which is one of my favourite TV shows ever, who can actually transform into a wolf herself. There's Bigby in the Fables comics in the Wolf Among Us game. I don't know if you know, but Fables is my favourite ever graphic novel/comic series, and Bigby is a fantastic character. He used to be a villain and now he's something of a complex kind of anti-hero, very, very interesting character. Love those comics. Love the game as well. What I'm saying is there are many, many wonderful retellings and reimaginings, and newer versions of the Little Red Riding Hood story. It's a wonderful one. It's something that has evolved for so long and come so far, and that we've all, I think, learnt so much from in different ways, and I just think it's kind of fantastic, and that's where I want to end this today. As always, please let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Let me know your favourite versions. Let me know if I missed any of the big, important historical versions. Let me know what you think the different versions of the stories mean and your interpretations of them, and what kind of morals and teachings and ideas and stuff you take from it. And this is where I'm going to end this today. Thank you so much for watching. Just as a quick note, I do have new merch available in my store with this adorable little cartoon version of Kyra, who you might have seen on the cover of her poetry book, Doggle Lessons. It's just a cute, fun little design of her, and it's available on t-shirts and mugs, and also little dog hoodies, so you can have your pet wear my pet's face on its back. Yeah. I'm going to be getting Kyra hopefully one of the little pink ones so she can wear her own face on her back, and it's going to be adorable. I love putting her in jumpers when it's cold. It's very, very cute. So if you want to get any of that stuff or any of my other merch designs, they're all designed by me. They're all designs that I love and I'm very passionate about, and I work on myself, and some of them are hand-drawn, some of them are digitally drawn, some of them are quotes from videos. There's all kinds of stuff with there, but you can check out my merch store at Teespring. The link is below or on screen now, or any of this crazy stuff, and it just helps support me and my channel and make sure I can keep making videos for you guys. Thank you for being so patient and lovely while I took a little bit of time off recently to kind of sort my head out. I just needed a bit of a mental health break. Spent some days in the countryside and with my friends, and yeah, no, it's been good. I think I'm feeling a bit better now, and it's good to have some space. So thank you for being patient with me while I did that. I'll hopefully be back to making videos more regularly now. Thank you for watching today. I'll see you again very soon. I appreciate you guys so much. And yeah, bye.